Your room was square. I once noticed from there in your bed as you slept, and I held my breath. By Stardust on the Moon. Tim turns the shower head on, making sure that the water was positively boiling before moving to switch the bathroom light off. Then he stripped down to his boxers. He couldn't bear to be completely naked in this moment in time. He climbed into the steaming shower, flinching away from the burning hot water before sinking into the strange bout of comfort it brings. He doesn't know how long he stands lifelessly under the spray before he picks up the body wash and flannel and then starts scrubbing himself raw. The stinging sensation that begins to spread over his skin does nothing to deter his action. Tim can feel as tears begin to fall down his cheeks. It had been months, and yet he could still feel unwanted hands dancing across his skin, those deceivingly soft touches that left him sore and covered in bruises for weeks. He swears sometimes that he was still there, that these past few months had simply been dissociative illusion. He could still feel the silken sheets, the satin robes, the heavy gold that grew warm on his skin. He could still feel the heat of the blazing sun beating down on him. He could still smell the incense that he liked to light each time he took him to his bed. His breath as he whispered in his ear, his hair on his chin as he kissed along his cheek. It was like he was still there. The feeling of ice-cold water washing over his scalding skin snapped him out of it, and he brought his mind back to the present. He contemplates staying in the shower for a bit longer despite the cold water, but ultimately he decides the cold he'd get in consequences to the decision isn't worth it. Tim sighs as he turns the shower off and carefully steps off of it, wrapping a soft plush towel around himself before awkwardly shuffling out into his wet boxers, whilst making sure he kept himself covered. He chucks the wet boxers in the corner with the rest of his dirtiest clothes, before walking over to the bathroom door and unlocking it. He walks through the halls of his home tense. Even the walk of his own home, he doesn't feel comfortable being this exposed. Not anymore. He misses the days he'd wander around with nothing but boxers on in the mornings, or the times he woke up in the middle of the night thirsty and wouldn't bother to throw on anything before making his way to the kitchen for a drink. Now he doesn't even sleep in his boxers, no matter how hot it gets. He actually went online and ordered more pajamas than he would possibly need as soon as he got back from rescuing Bruce. He shut his bedroom door behind him, locking it just as he did with the bathrooms. The curtains were already drawn close, and there on his bed were a fresh pair of boxers, a pair of gray sweatpants, and an old navy blue sweatshirt that was way too big on him. He's pretty sure it used to belong to Dick. As always, he gets everything out and ready before he showers, and he always makes sure the lights are off and the curtains are drawn beforehand as well. Tim shuffled closer to the bed before allowing the towel to fall off his frame, quickly replacing the towel with a fresh pair of boxers. Next, he shoved the sweatpants on, and then after that the navy blue sweater, and only once he was fully clothed did he turn the bedroom light on. Tim sighed as he picked up the discarded towel and put it in the laundry basket that sat in the corner of his room. He ran a hand through his hair as he unlocked his bedroom door and started making his way over to the bathroom. He flicked the bathroom light on and bundled up the particularly wet clothes on the floor in his arms, walking back to the bedroom and put them in his laundry basket as well. He picked up his phone that laid on his bedside table on charge, making sure to unplug it. As he started walking over to his kitchen, he scrolled through his notifications. 8 missed calls from Dick, 1 missed call from Bruce, 4 missed calls from Jason, 2 missed calls from Alfred, 3 missed calls from Damian. He sighed as he dismissed the notifications before pocketing his phone. There were a few texts as well, but he dismissed those alongside the others instead of opening them. He had missed the weekly family dinner and then skipped out on patrol too, so it was expected that they would try to reach out a few times. Alfred probably reached out to Tam after he couldn't get through to him, and Tam undoubtedly assured Alfred that he was okay, and Alfred most likely relayed that information back to everyone else. So logically, Tim has no need to assure everyone that he is all right so quickly. He usually did his best to attend the weekly dinners, and when he did skip them, he always shot off a text to someone with some excuse as to why he couldn't attend. So for him to miss dinner plus patrol without so much of a word, he could understand why that might spark a bit of concern with everyone. He's too tired right now to call anyone back or answer anyone's text. He'll shoot off a few placating texts in the morning with some excuse as to why he missed dinner and patrol without letting anyone know why. He flipped the kitchen light on as he entered, making a beeline towards his electric kettle. He grabbed a mug from the cupboard overhead and chucked the tea bag into it before putting it under the kettle. He pressed the on button and waited patiently for the water to boil and his tea to steep. Whilst he waited for that, he made his way over to the fridge and pulled out a pre-made chicken salad. Tam had ordered it for him for lunch whilst he was still at Wayne Enterprises. He just never got around to eating it. He picked up his tea from the side and made his way over to the living room. He settled himself down on the sofa with his tea and chicken salad. He put his tea on the coffee table in front of him and balanced his salad on his lap. He picked up the TV remote and flipped through the channels mindlessly before settling on some sitcom show he really couldn't give two cares about. After he placed the remote back down beside him, he pulled the stray blanket off the back of the sofa and put it around his shoulders. He tried to focus on the TV as he mindlessly picked at his salad, but he couldn't stop his thoughts from drifting over to the events today. He had woken up this morning already feeling terrible. He had woken up still feeling phantom hands groping at his skin and words whispering in his ear that he couldn't remember. It was frustrating waking up like that. It always without fail threw him off for the rest of the day. That being said, he still usually would have been able to attend dinner despite how off he felt. But of course, Roz had seen fit to have one of his many gifts delivered to him this morning, just before lunch. He doesn't quite remember what happened after, but he does know that Tam had found him not long after when she came to give him his lunch. She obviously deemed whatever state he was in unfit, because the next thing he remembers is her lying him on his bed. She had stayed with him the rest of the day, excusing him from work and doing whatever work she could from the comfort of his home. He has no doubts that she would have stayed the night with him if he hadn't done his hardest to convince her that he would be okay. Now, it wasn't the gift itself that left him spiraling after Roz had sent him many different gifts since he got back. But this gift was the first of its kind, and he was not delusional enough to think it would be the last. When he had gotten that box on his desk this morning, he thought that it might have been another book or something. But no. When he opened the gift, it was a set of green lingerie alongside a picture of him when he was still with the League, passed out on his bed. On the back of the picture, there was a note that read, "I hope to see you in this the next time you warm my bed, beloved." Unsigned, of course, but Tim knew who it was from. Tim was broken out of his approach downward spiral by the sound of the phone ringing yet again. He reaches over and places his barely touched salad on the coffee table before fishing his buzz phone out of his pocket. The caller ID showed that it was Tam calling him, most likely to check up one last time. He swiped on the accept call button before pressing the phone up to his ear. "Hi, Tam," he says hoarsely, coughs a bit before grabbing his mug from the coffee table and taking a sip of his tea, soothing his dry throat. Hi, Tim. I was calling to check that you were all right, she tells him softly through the phone. Tim sighs. He knew that was why she was calling, and he supposed he can't really fault her for it either. Fine, Tim. I'm just about to head to bed. He feels a little guilty for lying to her, but he knows the last thing he wants right now is to go back to bed and sleep. But what she doesn't know won't hurt her. I know you are, Tim. But if you're not, then just know I'm here for you, and I'm more than happy to spend the night around yours, or have you around mine if that's what you need. Tim worries at his lip. Tam's too good to him. He really doesn't deserve her. I know, thank you, he says quietly. Don't mention it. Also, don't bother coming in again until Monday. I've moved your schedule about, so don't worry about missing anything important, and just get some rest. Her stern voice leaves no room for arguments, but like a fool, Tim tried anyway. Tam, I'm fine. I don't need to miss any. And that's why I'm only having you take 4 days off instead of 2 weeks. Unless you feel that you need more. He could hear the threat in her voice, and he made a quick work to assure her that 4 days is more than enough before 4 days becomes 4 months. No, 4 days is enough. I'll be fine, he tells her hurriedly. I thought so. Now get some rest, Tim, and I'll catch you later. He sighs. I will. Oh, and Tim? Yeah? Call your family tomorrow. I don't want to get another call from Mr. Pennyworth asking if you're all right. She berated him, though the tinge of softness bled through it. He knew. Realistically, that even if he didn't call them tomorrow, there would be no real pushback from her. I get why you don't want to tell them what happened whilst you were away, or what's been happening since, but they still deserve to know that you're all right, Tim. He stays silent. He doesn't know how to respond to that truthfully. He hears her sigh over the phone. Get some rest, Tim. Good night. Good night, Tim, he whispers before hanging up and discarding his phone on the coffee table in front of him. He looked down the mug in his hands. The tea that he had barely drunk had gone cold. He frowned as he placed the now cold mug of tea back on the coffee table. He allowed himself to fall sideways until he laid on the sofa, bundled up in a blanket that still kept securely around his shoulders. He returned his attention back to the TV that he wasn't really sure was going on, but he was positive that he'd pick it up as it went along. He wasn't really sure what was going on, but he was positive that he'd pick it up as it went along. He wasn't sure how many episodes he watched or how long he was awake for, but eventually, as the night went on, he felt himself falling for the deceptively soft lullaby of sleep. He awoke with a gasp, panic seeping into his bones as he tried desperately to kick the blanket that was bundling up off of himself. His mind was still foggy with sleep, and his thoughts were still clouded with vivid images of his dreams. He flung himself off of his sofa, in his hasteful panic hitting his arm on the table as he fell. He hastily stands up after he had managed to untangle himself from the blanket. He hurriedly goes to turn on the light, grabbing a spare bow staff from the umbrella stand as he does. So, he fearfully scans his apartment for the monster that plagued his dreams. When he sees nothing out of place, he goes on his search his entire apartment, and only when his search turns up empty does he allow himself to relax. As the adrenaline slowly drains out of his body, his arm begins to flare up in pain. He winces at the sensation as he makes his way into his bathroom. He places his bow staff down on the side of the bath and then turns his attention over to his aching arm, grimacing as he sees the sleeve of his sweater he was wearing beginning to soak with blood. He winces as he pulls his sleeve up and sees a fairly sized cut on his arm. He assumes he cut it on the corner of the coffee table when he fell. He takes the sweater off, doing his best not to aggravate the wound any more than necessary, throwing the sweater off to the side carelessly when it was off. He turned the tap of the bathroom sink on, making sure the water was warm, and then ran his wound underneath the warm water for a few minutes. Whilst he did that, he fumbled through his medicine cabinet with his free hand, pulling out the gauze, bandages, medical tape, and antiseptic. After an appropriate amount of time, he pulled his injured arm out of the water and carefully patted the area dry with a bit of gauze. Once he deemed it was dry enough, he grabbed the antiseptic and gently but thoroughly cleaned his wound as best he could, clenching his teeth at the stinging sensation that occurred. Afterwards, he placed a clean bit of gauze over the wound, then wrapped a bandage around his arm, helping secure the gauze and protect his wound. Then he used a little bit of medical tape to help keep the bandage in place. Happy with his work, he placed all the medical supplies back into the cabinet before closing it. He picked the bloody sweater he had discarded off the floor and dumped it into the laundry basket. He then made his way to his bedroom, not before picking up his bow staff, though. Once he got into his bedroom, he rifled through his drawers before throwing on an old white t-shirt. He sighed as he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. He felt like he could cry from the frustration at this point. It had been months, and yet Roz still tormented him. He wasn't even safe in his sleep. He was constantly plagued with the nightmarish memories of the nights and days he'd spent in Roz's side. He wanted to shout, scream, yell, cry, and sob, but found himself too exhausted to do so. He just was so tired of everything. There was little he could do about it, though. He found it no use stewing in his bubbling feelings. He'd figure out a plan eventually. He always did. But until then, all he could do was endure. He hated sitting idly by and doing nothing, though, so he took to checking the apartment one last time. He checked all the windows, any potential hiding spots, the front door, and even swept the place for cameras and bugs. He came up empty, though that was to be expected. He felt himself relaxing that little bit more with the reassurance that he truly was alone. He made his way back to the sofa and wrapped himself back into a blanket burrito. He fumbled around for the TV remote, the TV having turned itself off whilst he was out, and promptly turned the TV back on. He messed about with channels for a moment before deciding to open up his Netflix account and put on Friends. Sue him! It made for good comfort show, and he could do with some good comfort right now. Tim had no intentions of going back to sleep. In fact, the very idea disgusted him at this moment in time, but even he was weak to the alluring arms of hypnosis embrace. Whatever god was out there seemed to pity him enough to grant him a dreamless rest for once, because when he woke up this morning, it wasn't to the phantom feelings of hands on his skin or the ghost of incense burning. No, when he woke up this morning, it was the sun on his face and the sound of cars on the road below. He rolled himself off the sofa, carefully rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. As he did so, he was thankful for the much-needed rest and made a mental note to get Tim a gift as a thank you for yesterday. He nabbed his phone off the coffee table and used it to check the time. 14:30. He let out a whistle when he saw that. He must have been really exhausted to sleep till 2. He should probably go brush his teeth and clean his wound. He didn't want it to get infected after all. After he had done that, he swung by his bedroom to dry swallow some of his daily antibiotics, and then made his way into the kitchen to grab himself something to eat. On his way there, he made a quick pit stop into the living room to proceed to grab his discarded salad and then undrank tea from last night, throwing away the salad and dumping the mug into the sink once he had gotten to the kitchen. He made himself some toast, cut open an avocado to go with it, and then drizzled it with honey for a hint of sweetness. He paired it with a nice cup of coffee that he made whilst his bread was toasting. Once everything was done, he sat down on his kitchen island and began to eat whilst going through his emails. Most of them were just the same old boring business emails, and he answered some of the more important ones and made a note to reply to the less pressing ones later. Strangely enough, though, he had an email from Bruce sitting in his inbox. By the looks of it, it was sent just a few hours ago at 12. Upon reading the email, he sees that Bruce is requesting a meeting pertaining Office of Wayne Enterprise matters. He calls bullcrap on that. Him and B barely ever have to collaborate together on business matters, given the fact that Tim was practically running the company while Bruce was on his sabbatical. He does email Bruce back, though, and simply lets him know that he was on leave until Monday. And if it was urgent, that Tim was fully capable and authorized to deal with any matters whilst he was gone. Tim puts his phone down after finishing off the last corner of his toast. He downs the last of his dregs of his coffee before standing up and depositing both the plate and the mug into the sink, alongside the other dirty dishes. He really needed to wash them. Despite last night's incident, he actually feels pretty good. Maybe he could get a few things done today, make use of his rare time off and all. With that decided, Tim rolls up his sleeves and puts on a pair of dish gloves. He had only managed to get a few of them done before the sound of his phone pinging with text distracted him. Oh, right, he needed to call or at least text everybody back. It was probably just one of them asking where the heck he's been. He pulls off the dish gloves and lays them down on the counter before walking over to the kitchen island where he left his phone. He hummed as he unlocked it and opened the text message, only to stare in horror at its contents. There, right there on his phone, was a picture of him from last night sleeping on his sofa. The text was from an unknown number, but Tim suspected he knew who it was from, and the accompanying message only confirmed his suspicions. Did you have sweet dreams, beloved? He felt sick. He was going to be sick. Tim quickly dropped his phone and clamped a hand over his mouth as he gagged into it helplessly. He quickly ran to his bathroom, just in time for him to throw up his breakfast into the toilet. He dry heaved a couple of times before he deemed himself done and pulled the flush. He pulled himself up on the shaky knees and just stood there for a moment. It didn't feel real. He didn't feel real. He sucked in shaky breaths and let out equal shaky puff of air. He repeated the motion a few more times. He should wash his hands and his mouth. That was a good place to start. He made quick work of washing the foul taste out of his mouth and cleaned his hands of any lingering germs. Somewhere along the process, his eyes begun to water. He wiped the unfallen tears away from the back of his hands. Crying wouldn't help anything. He made his way back to the kitchen on wobbly legs, then grabbed himself a glass of water. With trembling hands, he gulped it down greedily as if it was air. Once the glass was empty, he cast it aside in the sink with the other unwashed dishes. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and went to grab his bow staff once again. He went around his apartment once more, just as he did last night, and got to work checking for any cameras or bugs. When he came up empty once more, just like last night, he went around checking all the windows and the front door for any sign of forced entry. Frustrating, but not surprisingly, he found none. He wasn't sure what to do, and that only helped fuel his uneasiness. He made his way back to the kitchen and swiped on his phone off the kitchen island. Checking the time, he found that it was 5 in the evening. As he looked around his phone, he saw more messages from the unknown number. He didn't open them. He didn't want to open them. He shut his phone off and threw it carelessly to the side. He sucked in a harsh breath and ran his hand through his hair, griping at his fist. He tugged it gently, felt his bubbling fear crawling up his throat as he choked out a sob. He couldn't do this right now. He tightened his grip on the bow staff, still remained in his grasp as he swung around and stalked back towards his living room. He stole the stray blankets from the sofa and made his way towards a closet that sat off to the side of his lounge. He slipped into it and made himself a little nest from the stolen blankets. His breaths came in short, hiccuping sobs as he cried into his hands. He felt like a child hiding away from his fears in the closet like this. Just like he did before Bruce took him in. He felt ridiculous crying over something that happened so long ago. Over a photo, for goodness sake. But no matter how much he willed the tears to stop, they still kept coming. He couldn't breathe. His throat felt like it was closing up. He clawed helplessly at his throat. As he doubled over and pressed his head to the cushioned floor. He didn't know how long it was until he found his breath coming to him easier than before. He sat up slowly as his sobs quieted until they were nothing more than fleeting sniffles. He wiped the lingering tears off his cheeks before pulling a blanket around his shoulders and leaning back against the cold door. He forced himself to take a few deep breaths. He was fine. He is fine. He can't shake off the embarrassment that seeps into his bones over hiding and crying in the closet like a small child. He hates that it made him feel better. He pulls his knees further up to his chest and just sits there and breathes for a while. Running his hands over the surface of the blanket as a way to help ground himself. He should probably get out soon. It wouldn't do him any good to fall asleep in here, especially given the fact that he couldn't even straighten his legs out in front of him. It wouldn't do anyone any harm to stay for a little while longer, though. He didn't even know he was drifting off until he was jolted awake by the sound of his windows being opened. He sucked in a sharp breath and searched blindly in the dark of the closet for his bow staff hidden in the best of the blankets. He kept his breathing purposely slow and quiet as he heard heavy footsteps walking around his apartment. Was Roz, or more likely one of his ninjas, really coming around again? Was he hoping to get another picture or something else? He let out a sigh of relief when his hand wrapped around the bow staff that was previously hidden between the blankets and pillows. If he was any lucky, then whoever was in his apartment would give up and leave, then he wouldn't have to use it. He got blissfully hopeful that was going to be the case after the apartment fell silent. He couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, only for his eyes to widen in fear as the closet door reached open by the figure. He quickly tightens his grip on the staff and unfolds it with a flick of the wrist. He goes to strike the person with it only to relax his stance once he sees who it is. "Jason?" he says tentatively. And there Jason stood in full Red Hood regalia. Jeez, replacement? What the heck happened? You're an absolute mess. Yeah, Tim couldn't really argue there. He was huddled up in the closet in a makeshift blanket nest. His eyes were probably still red, and his arm was still wrapped up in a bandage. He couldn't help but feel a little vulnerable as he pulled the blankets tighter around himself. He looked pathetic. Jason sighed. All right, up we get. He kneeled down to Tim's height and grabbed him by the arms and heaved him up. Come on, Timbo, Jason muttered gently as he guided him towards his sofa with a hand between his shoulder blades. Tim allowed Jason to push him onto the sofa so that he sat down and watched as he took his Red Hood helmet off and placed it onto the coffee table in front of him, before Jason came to stand in front of him. Jason, why are you here? Tim asked curiously, though he made sure to keep his voice firm. He didn't want Jason dancing around the question and not giving him an answer. Not that he could make Jason tell him anything right now, but illusion of power and all that. Why do you think, replacement? You weren't completely MIA, and no one so much as heard from you apart from Bruce. And that was when you told him you weren't going to be at work with no explanation why. And Tim, you never take time off work. Tim watches as he runs his hand through his hair. So that's what he forgot to do today. Yesterday, he frowns. What day was it? Kid, even the demon brat was worried about you. Oh, Jason was still talking. He should probably pay attention. Sorry, it's just been a bad couple days, he whispered apologetically, turning his gaze away from Jason and towards his lap. Kid, Jason starts softly. You ain't been right since you came back from saving B. We thought if we gave you your space, you might fix yourself up. But clearly, that ain't working. Jason's words got a little sterner towards the end. Tim just twiddled his thumbs. He really didn't know what to say in response to that. He heard Jason sigh before he crouched down in front of him and placed his hands on his knees. Tim couldn't deny that the touch wasn't grounding. We can't help ya if you don't tell us what's going on, replacement. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice, or the grounding hands on his knees, or the fact that he was just so freaking tired, but Tim just broke down there and then. He told Jason everything, what his time in the league was actually like, the presents, the notes, the pictures and the text messages, everything. Once he started, he couldn't stop. The words just kept tumbling out of his mouth clumsily. Miraculously, though, he didn't cry. Maybe there wasn't anything left for him to cry. When the words finally stopped pushing their way out, a tense silence fell around the two of them. Tim didn't dare look up from his lap up at Jason. He couldn't bear to see the look on his face. He knew he was disgusting, weak, pathetic for allowing it to happen, for breaking down about it like a baby. He knows he has no right to feel bad about it, to feel violated as he does. There was a point in time where he was a willing participant after all. He doesn't want to see the disgust on Jason's face. Before Tim even knew what was happening, he found himself wrapped up in Jason's embrace. One hand on the nape of his neck, holding his head up against his chest, and the other hand rubbing soothing circles into his back. Oh, baby bird, he murmured quietly into Tim's hair. Tim sucked in a large gulp of air. He released a breath he wasn't even aware he was holding, his hands coming up to hold onto Jason's jacket. Jason stayed there, crouched awkwardly as he held Tim for a length of time neither knew before he pulled away. Though he didn't go far, he shifted his hold so that his hands were holding on to Tim's elbows. He shifted his hold so he was holding on to Tim's elbows. When was the last time you had something to eat, kiddo? The words were murmured gently. For Tim's sake, no doubt. This morning, but, I threw that up. So maybe last night? He thought back to the untouched salad that he tried to eat but ultimately abandoned. Yesterday morning? Jason let out a sigh that was more akin to a huff of air. Okay, Timbo, here's what we're gonna do. You're gonna go have a shower, and while you're doing that, I'm gonna make you something to eat. And then Dickie's gonna come on over and take you back to the manor. That's good? Despite his words, Jason's tone left no room for arguments. It was more of a, here's what's happening, than a, are you okay with this? Tim opened his mouth to protest, but he really didn't want to shower, and he was kind of hungry, and he supposed it'd be all right if Dick came over. He does give the best hugs after all, and Roz or his stupid ninjas couldn't get to him in the manor. He closed his mouth and nods his head. That seemed to be the right response because Jason seemed pleased as he helped him up off the sofa and sent him down the hall towards the bathroom. As soon as Tim had turned around the corner and was out of sight, Jason's carefully put-together calm demeanor faded as clear signs of rage overtook his features. He ran a hand through his hair and willed the green that was creeping into his vision away. He could get angry later. He had stuff to do right now. He made his way towards the kitchen and went rifling through Tim's cupboards before landing on a can of chicken noodle soup. It's some cheap stuff that was basically just chicken broth with a handful of noodles thrown at the bottom. It'll do for now. Tim could probably do with something easier on his stomach anyways. As he was setting up the stove to cook the soup, he spotted Tim's phone sitting off to the side. He slipped it in his pocket for later. He certainly wants to see what exactly Roz was sending his little brother. And he's sure the others would too. After he had gotten the soup simmering on the stove, he fishes his phone out of his pocket and called Dick. He picked up on the third ring. Hey, little Wing, what's up? I thought you were still out on a patrol. Dick's voice floated through the phone calmly. I ended it a bit early. Thought I'd call around Timbo's place and see if he was dead yet. How is he? Is he all right? The laid-back attitude instantly drains from his voice at Jason's words as he frantically asks about Tim's well-being. I won't lie and say the baby bird's all right, but he ain't dead or nothing. Look, Dick, I don't want to stay on the phone too long. I wanted to get something into the kid and make sure he's safe before I take off. Okay, Jay. Just tell me what happened. I'll tell you when you get here. The green is being real persistent right now, and I don't want to make it worse by rehashing it before I can make sure someone's here for Timmy if I need to take off. Okay, little Wing, I'll be there in 10. With the sound of the call being disconnected rang through Jason's ears. When Tim finally emerged from the hallway, freshly cleaned, it was to the sight of Dick and Jason having what looked like a rather tense discussion by the looks on their faces. When they both noticed Tim, though, they quickly schooled their expressions into carefully constructed, calm masks. Dick smiled as he saw Tim and opened his arms for a hug, though he left the choice to Tim, who of course allowed himself to be wrapped up in Dick's comforting hug. Hi, Bubba. Dick whispered softly into Tim's hair as he squeezed him tightly. Tim muttered a small hi back. Stop hugging him, Dickface. The kid needs to eat. Jason's voice interrupted them. Dick gave him one last squeeze before pulling away from him, an apologetic smile on his face as he guided Tim over to the kitchen island. A bowl of soup sat on the marble countertop in front of him. He picked up the spoon next to it and began taking small bites. "All right, replacement, I've got to bounce, but I'll see you in the manor after patrol." Jason ruffled his hair as he passed, slipping out of the window. It was just him and Dick in the apartment now, and while he didn't mind being alone with Dick, he didn't really know what to say. He wasn't an idiot. He had no doubts that Jason had told Dick about Roz. It also wouldn't surprise him if he was going to tell the others as well, if he hasn't done so already. "All right, baby bird, I'm gonna go pack you a bag, and then we'll get going once you're done." Dick placed a kiss on the side of his head before heading off down his hallway and towards his bedroom. Tim had only managed to eat half of the soup by the time Dick came back with a bag one hand and a little orange bottle of his pills in the other. "Shoot!" He hadn't told anyone about his spleen thing yet. Apart from Tam and Prue, though they didn't really count 'cause they were Tam and Prue. "Tim, what are these?" Dick shook the bottle for emphasis. He pulled his gaze away from Dick and looked down at his bowl. "They're phenoxamethylpenicillin. They're antibiotics for my splenia." "Tim, when did you lose your spleen?" "In the desert, when I was with the League." Tim could see the way Dick's eyes blazed and the way his jaw clenched in anger before he took a deep breath to calm himself down. Okay, we can talk about this later." Unzipped the bag and slipped the antibiotics into the bag. Tim worried at his lip. He knew he should have been better, that he shouldn't have been able to have been hit so easily. He didn't want them to know. He didn't want them to see him as weak. He wasn't weak. He took the appropriate precautions so as not to be liable in the field due to his asplenia. He didn't want to have to prove that to Bruce, or any of them. Not again. "You done, Bubba?" Dick asked, gesturing to the now cold soup that he hadn't touched for a while. Tim nodded his head. Dick picked up his bowl and washed it up quickly into the sink before placing it on the drying rack. "Come on then, kiddo. Let's go." Dick placed a hand on Tim's shoulder and guided him out of his apartment and down into his car. They spent the car ride in comfortable silence. Tim just stared out the window, watching as the world went by. He really needed to pull himself together. They pulled up at the manor not long after, though Tim suspects it just feels that way because he zoned out. "Come on, Timbo." Dick pushed his shoulder before grabbing his bag and getting out of the car. Tim took a minute to steel himself before following. Dick met him with an encouraging smile, and together they walked up to the manor door. Tim played with the sleeves of his sweater while Dick rang the doorbell, and they both waited for someone to answer it. It didn't take long before the door swung open. Tim thought it would be Alfred that would answer, like usual, but surprisingly, it was Bruce that stood in the doorway. Tim ducked his head down awkwardly, shuffled into the manor with Dick once Dick had stepped out of the way, and ushered them in. Dick muttered something to Bruce before ducking out of the hallway, leaving it just the two of them. The silence that grew felt thick, uncomfortable, and awkward. Bruce wasn't saying or doing anything, and neither was Tim. They both weren't sure what to do in this moment, so they just ended up standing there. Finally, it was Bruce that bridged the gap, pulling Tim into a hug. One hand cradled his head against his chest, and the other was wrapping around his shoulders, effectively cocooning Tim into a hug. Tim's eyes widened, and Then his breath hitched. Before he knew it, he was crying again. "Dad!" he hiccuped, grasping onto the front of Bruce's suit. "Oh, sweetheart," Bruce murmured, heart breaking at the plea waved into his son's voice. A plea he can't answer, for what can he do to end his son's pain? When the tears finally stopped falling, they pulled away from each other, and Bruce began guiding him upstairs towards his old bedroom. He pushed the door open for him, but stayed in the doorway after nudging him gently. "You get some rest, okay, sweetheart? Your brothers and I will be just downstairs if you need us. Don't be afraid to call or come find one of us if you need anything at all, even if it's just someone to sit with," he told Tim gently, willing all of his love for the boy into his voice. He just nodded and wiped at his nose with the sleeve of his sweater, and watched as Bruce closed the door behind him. Just as Tim was about to turn around and head to bed, there was a knock on his bedroom door. Confusion and half thinking it was B, or maybe even Dick, having forgotten something, he went over to the door to answer it. To his surprise, it was Damian standing on the other side of the door. Before he could say something, Damian opened his mouth and cut him off. "Father and Richard have informed me that you are hurt. Though they would not tell me how you are hurt, they have informed me that I should allow you to get your adequate amount of rest before morning. However, I seek to know if I should fetch you a physician, as it would be a great dishonor to Father's name if you should bleed out due to medical neglect." Despite the coldness of his words and the indifference he tried to portray, Tim could see the sincerity in his eyes and hear genuine worry in his voice. He smiled at him, something he hoped looked real enough, and ruffled the kid's hair. "I'm all right, dames. I just need a bit of rest, so I'll be hanging around the manor for a few days." Damian, seemingly satisfied with his words, nodded his head. "Very well then, Drake. I will see you at breakfast." The kid then turned on his heel and marched down the hallway. Tim closed the bedroom door before finally turning around and collapsing into the bed. All that crying had really tuckered him out. For the first time in a while, Tim actually felt safe as he drifted off to sleep. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry that this is so late. I promised this like almost a month ago, I think, at this point. My thanks to the author for being so patient. By that I mean not pestering me personally. I am so sorry. I will be getting back to Sonoy after this, and I will be doing some editing of the last chapter. I won't be reading it all. I'll probably split it up into a few parts because this took 40 minutes to record and I had to do it twice. Of course, that just means that I got to read it a lot of times, and that's always a win. I have been reading this for a couple of months on and off because it keeps circling through my tag hunts, and I kind of just love it. So yeah, it's Monday and not Friday, and my apologies to every single one of you. Like, comment, and subscribe. Leave kudos on original site. Drink water and sleep tight.